Welcome to Hard Talk. I'm Stephen Sackur. One of the most costly conflicts of the 21st century may be over. Representatives of the Ethiopian government and Tigrayan rebels signed a peace agreement earlier this month after 2 years of war and perhaps 500,000 civilian deaths. Tigrayan forces are to give up their weapons. The Ethiopian army will take control of Tigray, and aid should begin to reach millions of desperate people. My guest is Getachew Reda, who signed the deal on behalf of the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front. Was this, in effect, the TPLF's surrender? Getachew Reda in Mekele, Tigray, welcome to Hard Talk.
My pleasure, Stephen.
It's a pleasure to have you on the show. Let me begin with a very simple question. There you sit in Mekele, the capital of Tigray region. If you go outside right now, who is in control? Is it the Ethiopian armed forces, the federal armed forces, or is it your forces from the TPLF?
It's our forces who are firmly in control of Megala.
Right, so this is a very delicate stage of the peace process because over the next few days there is supposed to be a disengagement process and then full authority and control of Mekele and other key towns and cities, your airports and everything else is supposed to be handed over to the federal government and federal forces, right?
The federal forces, we have agreed, will control federal institutions. We have submitted ourselves to the federal constitution, which provides that federal institutions will be under federal control. So as far as airports are concerned, other federal institutions concerned, they will be in the hands of the federal government. Otherwise, the constitution also provides that regional authorities will exercise control over regional matters. So we're not in any way negating the constitutional principle.
But what matters most, particularly in the context of a terrible 2-year war, is who has the guns and who imposes their authority with the gun. And according to the deal that you signed at the beginning of this month with the Ethiopian representatives, your TPLF forces are going to disarm within 30 days. So clearly, your forces will no longer have the power of the gun.
Well, to begin with, the fact that the agreement is being referred to as between TPLF and the federal government is a bit of a stretch, because it was a deal between the government and the regional government and the federal government. Whatever superlatives there, though, what we have agreed is as long as the security interests of Tigray are taken care of, and as long as the political conditions that gave rise to the conflict in the first place are duly taken care of, which would, of course, involve some kind of political dialogue between our two sides, and then we have no business maintaining our artillery pieces or our tanks, because the tanks and artillery pieces did not belong to Tigray in the sense that we didn't have them when the conflict broke out. We stood against any imposition by the federal government or its partners on us, and we fought hard, and of course we captured most, if not all, of the weapons from our adversaries.
Right, but so if I may, I just want to be very clear here, because it's a very tight schedule that you agreed to. You said that, yes, within 30 days, the Tigrayan forces, you can call them whatever you want, but it is the TPLF armed force. You said they would be demobilized and disarmed within 30 days. Now, the clock is ticking. Several of those days have already passed. So is that already happening?
No, disengagement is happening. At least we are doing our part as far as disengagement is concerned. But this is not something that can be done only because we have the willingness to do so. It requires several arrangements between our two forces, and the commanders of the two sides have been in contact. And of course, the Nairobi arrangement was essentially about making sure that whatever tight schedule was put in place by the politicians in Pretoria would be implemented in a manner that takes into account the security requirements of Tigray. Because you should know that Tigray is not facing threats not only from the federal government, but also from the Eritrean government and other troops.
I do understand that, and we'll talk about Eritrea and their forces in a moment. But let us stick to what matters most. You know, people around the world have seen how terrible, how costly this 2-year conflict has been. Hundreds of thousands of lives lost of civilians, let alone the fighters lost as well on both sides. So I just want to be very clear. Nothing that's happened in the last few days since you were in Pretoria and signed the agreement, nothing has happened to change your commitment to disarm and demobilize TPLF fighting forces, right?
Well, nothing has changed, but we still expect a number of actions to be carried out before that kind of stuff happens. What we are saying is not, I mean, disarmament is a political process that requires not just a month, but probably months, if not years. What we are saying here is we are ready to leave the past behind us, to make sure that our people get the kind of respite they so richly deserve after the suffering the last 2 years, that we are ready to address political problems in a peaceful and political manner, and that will be willing to hand over heavy weapons and heavy armaments as long as the security interests of Tigray are taken care of. We are ready to abide by the constitution. That has been our call from day one, and we are ready to do so. And nothing so far has changed, although there is a very slow process with regard to the implementation of the process. But at least with regard to this engagement, we have been doing our part. And I would say the federal government, the Federal Defense Forces commanders, and the commanders of our forces have been communicating on a daily basis. And I have reason to believe that these things can be taken care of and in a manner that addresses the security concerns of Tigray.
Are you ready to acknowledge here and now that you in Tigray, the TPLF, you lost the war?
No, we don't lose a war. This is a people's war. People fighting against tyranny, people fighting against any imposition from outside, from inside. And these are people who are fiercely in favor of exercising their rights. Whether there is a willingness on our part to resolve this peacefully, it has always been there. We have been consistent. If you remember the last time I was on your show, we've been saying that we're ready to resolve our differences peacefully. We're not interested in the corridors of power. As long as those security concerns, those political issues that gave rise to the conflict in the first place are not addressed, the people of Tigray will not lay their arms. Whether I sign a deal or not is not of significance as long as those problems still persist, as long as our people continue to suffer under the kind of siege that our enemies have long imposed on us.
Yeah, but the thing is, I do remember our last interview, which was in August 2021, and I went back and I looked at what you said to me then, and then you were in a real fighting mood, and you said to me, until the entire war military apparatus that has caused us misery and chaos in Tigray ceases to operate, we will continue to take whatever action is necessary. It is quite clear, even to the spring and summer of this year, you and all of your leadership in Tigray thought you could win. But the bottom line is, you haven't won, you have capitulated. You have agreed to disarm and demobilize your forces. As we've already established, the federal government is going to put its forces into all the key installations in Tigray. It will be in control, and all you have is a promise that in the future you will be reincorporated into the federal system.
Well, I wouldn't agree with your simple arithmetic of people. Like you said, we've been saying that what we need is security in Tigray. What we need is addressing the overall political problems that afflicted the region, and of course the imposition that the siege that was imposed on us. We have done everything and will continue to do in our power, whether that is through the barrel of gun or through peaceful means what has changed at this point in time.
What did you think, Getachew Reda? What did you think when Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed he went down to greet his supporters in the south of Ethiopia on November 3rd? That is the day after you signed that agreement in Pretoria, and he proclaimed that he had and his government had achieved a, quote, historical victory. They had achieved, he said, 100% of the things that they set out to achieve in the negotiations with you. If he has won 100% of what he wanted, I put it to you that whatever you say to me, the people of Tigray and Ethiopia will see you as the losers.
Well, I'm not particularly interested in whether the people consider me a loser or not. What matters to me is whether the interest of the people of Tigray is taken care of. Whether that is going to be done through the barrel of gun or through peaceful means is of little significance. But in fact, I prefer it to be done in a peaceful manner. That's what we have agreed. I'm not going to comment on what the Prime Minister has to say about 100% victory in any arrangement. To say that you have achieved 100% would require a bit of stretch. That's not my point. I want this arrangement to work in a manner that benefits the people of Tigray, in a manner that stops the suffering of the people of Tigray. And the people of Tigray can only be put to an end as long as all the issues that have caused this conflict in the first place are addressed and fully. Whether that happens will remain to be seen. What we have achieved so far is a cessation of hostilities. Whether there is a commitment on the part of the federal government to run the entire course will remain to be seen. It's our hope and expectation, if I may say so, that remain true.
Yeah. Well, as you say, it remains to be seen, and that's why this issue of disarmament is so very important. I just wonder whether you worry that there is a significant chunk of your own population in Tigray who may not accept the deal that you and other leaders of the TPLF have done. I'm going to quote to you Kjetil Tronvoll, a scholar of Ethiopian politics based in Oslo. He watches these things very carefully, and he says that what you've done is extremely controversial, and it will be difficult to convince Tigrayan forces to, quote, voluntarily disarm and make themselves, in effect, indefensible in the face of an enemy that they have been fighting for the last 2 years. Do you worry you may not be able to sell this deal to some of your own people?
Rest assured, what we are going to sell is not a carte blanche disarmament where we'll find ourselves as a lame duck against enemies. What we are trying to do with the federal government, and we hope and expect the federal government to reciprocate, is to make sure that whatever security threats stack up against Tigray are fully addressed. For example, the security considerations should take into account the forces arrayed against us, the Eritrean forces, other forces which are not part of ENDF. And of course, there are a number of issues that need to be addressed. We're not saying we are going to lay our arms down simply because there is an agreement. What we are saying is we'll lay our arms down as long as those issues are resolved. And we expect them to be resolved and soon. I mean, we are giving this an opportunity.
This is so important. You've just mentioned Eritrean forces, and you're suggesting that if Eritrean forces stay on your territory, then you may not actually hand over your weapons. You may not demobilize your forces. And we know from Tigrayan TV reporting and also from some officials in your own TPLF organization, they are saying just within the last few days that Eritrean forces are continuing to operate on your territory, continuing, to quote one of your officials, to commit crimes including killing, kidnapping and shelling around Shire and Adidero, 2 areas in Tigray. So if that's still happening, if the Eritrean soldiers are still there fighting your forces, are you telling me this whole deal is off?
I'm not saying the whole deal is off. The whole deal will be off if the federal government started. It's part of the promise. It's part of the responsibility to not only convince the Eritreans to withdraw, but also other forces which are not part of the ENDF. That's part of our deal. What we are saying is we are ready to lay down our arms as long as it is, because we know that peace is in the best interest of our people. We have more IDPs today than we had a year ago. We have more people suffering the consequences of not just only bullets, but also lack of medicine and lack of food today than a year ago. So we'll do everything in our power to make sure that we make painful concessions so our people could survive as a people. But if that means allowing our people to suffer needlessly in the hands of people who should have left the country a long time ago, people who've been invited by the federal government to do the kind of carnage they have been committing, then there is no point for us to lay down on arms, because the whole idea of disarmament is not about handing over your weapons. It's about making sure that there is a sustainable peace. Whether I have signed a deal in Pretoria or in Nairobi is going to be material as long as the underlying problems that have brought about the situation right now are addressed and addressed fully.
You talk about painful concessions, and I feel a little bit of pain in your voice. In all honesty and on reflection, do you wish that you and the TPLF leadership had not started this war back in November 2020, a war which has cost, the Ghent University research team reckons, up to 600,000 civilian lives, caused immense hardship to millions of your people? Do you wish that you hadn't, in the end, attacked that federal army base on Tigrayan territory back in November of 2020?
We didn't start the war. It was imposed on us. But I wish it didn't happen. I wish there was a chance for us to deal with this problem peacefully. But I'm not saying that we assume full responsibility for starting the war, because we didn't start the war. It was imposed on us.
Let's talk about the humanitarian situation, because in a way that matters more than anything else in this unfolding story. I've talked about the civilian death toll, but there are still millions of people, according to UN agencies, at real risk of starvation in a humanitarian catastrophe which is not yet over. Now, part of this deal says that the Ethiopian federal government must facilitate the aid supplies getting into Tigray as of now. Is that happening?
Well, I'm not sure if it's happening the way we would have liked it to, because in the first place, the whole idea of facilitation of aid should not have been part of a deal. And I don't consider it part of a deal. It is something that should have been done by the federal government without putting any conditions. And I'm not complaining that they have put it forward as a condition. But as things stand, despite the commitments by the international community, the kind of progress that we are seeing so far is nothing to write home about. We were expecting flights last week and today. Apparently, these flights have been cancelled. Well, we suspect that some political games are involved here. We still are engaging the international community. I know of some trucks carrying medicine that have made it to Tigray. There are also probably dozens of trucks that have so far made it to Tigray. But the enormous challenge that we are facing in terms of the humanitarian catastrophe that has befallen Tigray requires that these efforts need to be not only facilitated, but also redoubled. I mean, what the kind of magnitude of suffering that we are undergoing right now requires a much stronger and a much more focused effort on the part of international community, and the federal government should do its part and do it in a manner that doesn't leave any room whatsoever for doubts with regard to its sincerity about its commitment.
Now, the deal that you and others worked on in Pretoria and then in Nairobi as well, it talks about the need to find a pathway to unity and to quote-unquote healing in Ethiopia. Part of that surely has to be a full independent accounting for what appear to have been egregious abuses and war crimes committed, frankly, by both sides in this war. Are you, speaking for the TPLF, are you prepared to say you will accept independent investigation of all of the accusations and allegations levelled at TPLF forces in this conflict?
We have been consistent to a fault when it comes to submitting ourselves to independent investigation. We will remain committed to an independent investigation and assume full responsibility as long as there are findings that implicate us, myself included.
Do you know what happened in Kobo and Chene, for example, in August, September 2021, where it is alleged, and the UN Human Rights Council's Commission of Human Rights Experts has indeed investigated this. It is alleged that there were grave human rights abuses committed by Tigrayan forces, which included murder of civilians, sexual assault, rape, looting. Are you aware of those particular charges, and have they been investigated by your side?
I'm aware of the charges. I'm aware of the allegations. And we have told the international human rights organizations, including the independent, the UN Human Rights Council people, that we are open for investigation. In fact, we have our version of the story, and it's not the time to try to exculpate us. But I would tell you this. Our forces have never been involved in any systematic attack against civilians. Well, I cannot vouch for any isolated incidents here and there. We know of cases where some off-grid fighters were involved in some kind of activities, but that doesn't amount to the kind of systematic attack that was wrought on our population by the combining force of the federal government and the Eritrean forces and their partners for the last 2 years. But it's not a question of ensuring parity of crimes. What we are saying is we are open for independent investigation, and we remain committed to that promise.
Before we end, let's just talk briefly about the future. Basic question: do you trust Abiy Ahmed and the federal government of Ethiopia? Do you trust in their good faith to make this agreement work?
I don't have to trust them, but I have to assume good faith. And of course, as they say, I would hope for the best and prepare for the worst. But at this point in time, I would rather focus on making this arrangement to work so that my people will have the kind of respite they so richly deserve. And we are, as a government, willing to do everything to make sure that our people's suffering ends, and soon.
And finally, one of the mediators who brokered this deal, former President Obasanjo of Nigeria, he said he hoped it would be a new dawn for Ethiopia. When we last spoke, you had real doubts about whether Tigray's future lay within Ethiopia. You said that there may be a different future for Tigray. Are you prepared now to say to me that you are committed to a Tigray future within a federal Ethiopia? That is your future, and you are happy to exist within the federal constitution of Ethiopia?
One has to be sure about the arrangements. What we have agreed in Pretoria is what we have always been declaring in public, that as long as our self-determination rights are fully preserved, fully protected, we'll be willing to live within Ethiopia. I have told you the last time I appeared on your show that we have never been separatists. We have never been for secession or anything. But secession is a function of whether people feel represented and fully represented in the body politic of the country. As long as that suspicion on the part of the population persists, it doesn't matter whether I believe in an Ethiopian unity or not. What matters is whether the authorities in Addis Ababa or the entire population is ready to do what it takes to make sure that this country, Ethiopia, belongs to Tigrayans, and Tigrayans feel fully represented in Ethiopia. If that doesn't happen, there is no point for me to make promise after promise.
Getachew Reda, I thank you for joining me from Mekele on Hard Talk. I should apologize to you and indeed to all our viewers. The audio and the video quality is not the best, but it is a hugely important subject, and we're happy to talk to you. Thank you very much for joining us on Hard Talk.
My pleasure, Stephen.